And so I don't
Lovely.
want you to lose a minute. I
Ah,
am
well.
very proud to introduce Babette. I count her among my friends, and she is someone that if you don't know, you should certainly get to know because she is very interesting. She really needs no introduction, but I've got a little something to say about her. She is a professor of philosophy at Fordham, and if we were to start talking about her publications, it would take up all the time she has to speak. Her most two recent books, published in German in 2020 and 2021, one is on Nietzsche and antiquity, and another is on Nietzsche and art. And she has a new book in English on Gunther Anders' philosophy of technology in 2021. So I give you an experience of a lifetime, Babette Babich.
Well, what I'd like to do, greetings, thank you very, very much. I do need to share a screen just because ideally that will help a bit. You should see a screen. Can you give me a confirmation that you
Yes.
see? Thank you very much. Our combo Leonardo vision. Ah, and I have another version of it. That's kind of what's behind me. The title, as you see, is different from what you have in the program. I share that with the chat. If you can, if you care to do that, it's a Heidegger fetish to read the paper along with the presentation. But in this particular case, there is a PowerPoint, so you might want to look at that too, if you like. Posthumanism, transhumanism, and Heidegger. And I'm actually also going to be talking about Heidegger, which is not always what people want to do, but it's what I'm going to do. This begins with a Vorrede, so there's a tiny little section, and I'll delimit them as best I can. And like everyone, I want to begin by thanking Róisín. I want to do that because she's organized what I think is a very challenging conference protocol, something that we have difficulty with. And that's because, for the most part, it's like students. I'm letting people into the waiting room. This is awful. Okay, sorry about that. In the vapors, in the aethers of Zoom, which is what I'm doing. Now, I spoke about Heidegger and Eta. The one time I was in Walla Walla in Washington at a Heidegger Circle meeting, no one asked a question, which means no one was interested. But these days, we live our lives, academic lives in any case, and sometimes all kinds of other lives with family, in those same aethers. For complex reasons, I wasn't able to submit a revision of hermeneutics and technoscience, a very, very complicated paper. That's the text in the program on planes and such. But I hope to speak on a related topic. There's the planes and such, as they are more nanotech bits and fibers than airplanes at a philosophy of technology conference next month in Lille, where I won't really be, just as I'm now speaking to you in Spokane, but not really. The closest I got was Róisín and Dan's slides. Those are the nanotech bits I'm talking about. This midnight hour, as it is for me, that's the technological science thing. In Winchester, that's where I am. That's Alfred, he of the cakes, as I call him, is the same time of night, round midnight, of the last real talk I gave in person at a so-called long night. This was organized by the French embassy of philosophy at the Brooklyn Public Library, which happens to be where I grew up. And thanks to Elizabeth Yuan, a freelance journalist in the audience who tweeted the moment, I have a photograph, she has that there, from the second of two talks I gave that night. Then I spoke on Nietzsche and life and, of course, death. In what follows, I'll talk about posthumanism, which is almost the same thing, and transhumanism, which is certainly the same thing, and which, given our new vaccines, is still about technoscience and a hermeneutic reflection on Heidegger's claim in Gelassenheit that an uncanny change in the world moves, this is a quote, upon us. The next section is Gonzaga and Heidegger's pseudo-concreteness. It was with respect to the human condition that Gunther Anders, Heidegger's student and Hannah Arendt's ex, would decry what he called Heidegger's pseudo-concreteness. This is complex, as Heidegger seems so very concrete that scholars to this day insist on describing him as, that's Gunther Anders and Hannah Arendt, as a existentialist, German existentialist. That's Heidegger's face, I think, on the cover. In fact, Heidegger was not an existentialist, but he does say of Dasein, das Wesen dieses Seienden liegt in seinem Zu-Sein. The essence of this entity, this Dasein, lies in its to be. At issue in its being for itself, Dasein is thereby distinctive in its overt minus, je meines, specifically, very, very importantly, meines wiederum je in diese oder jene Weise zu sein. Now, in spite of the immediacy of the being to be investigated for the sake of the so-called Seinsfrage, the me in each case tends to be unowned. As such, to this extent, Anders himself, here in concord with Heidegger, observes that even in its fullest concretion, Dasein can be characterized, that's his comment, by inauthenticity. Thus, most of the time, and in most ways, Dasein is inauthentic, not itself. Infamously complicating matters, Heidegger insists that what he calls inauthenticity doesn't correspond to a lower degree, niedrigeren Seinsgrad. Very, very importantly, but much rather, as he says, and quite concretely, inauthenticity determines Dasein in its fullest concretion. And you see where Gunther Anders gets the word, concretion. That's when you're concrete, when busy, when excited, when interested, when ready for enjoyment. Here, Heidegger reminds us of a perplexing reflex towards the conclusion of Augustine's Confessions, asking what, after all, could be closer to me than myself to myself. Quid autem propinquius me ipsum mihi? Augustine's answer, and this is a great question because we know it, it's typically underread or passed over, and the beauty of the formula, confounding for Augustine, who constantly submits his text before deity, mihi quaestio factus sum, and you see the translation above. Augustine's reflection on time includes a variation, alteration on this questioning after himself, repeating his own proximity to himself, the logical proximity of meiness, coincident immediacy, and concrete presence being part of this is key. In the same way, the notion of meiness invites Heidegger's reader to read along with him. And that's what we've all been doing in this conference so far, free to fault Heidegger's observations, just as Anders does, just as many do. And Heidegger invites this. In the same way, Augustine's writerly style can seem to be a literal confession, even as Pierre Hadot reminds us that in the case of Augustine, this betrays a want of learning, an ahistorical reading. In a 1979 footnote to the second volume, this is Anders I'm talking about, Anders outlived Heidegger, to this what it would be the second volume of the antiquatedness of the human, Anders reflected on these are his books. You see it in French, L'Obsolescence de l'Homme, which is unfortunate that they translated it that way in French because they will mistranslate it into English in that way. The Antiquiertheit, there's mention. Second volume, right there, 1979. Anders meditates on the exploitation, as he says, of body parts, parallel to the case of concentration camp victims, as an age, what he calls it, of cannibalism, beginning, according to Anders, in Auschwitz, including the extraction of, I quote Anders, gold teeth and hair. As Anders reports, I quote, American soldiers returned home from the Pacific with Japanese gold teeth, telling the reader, this is Anders' report, that with his own eyes, with Anders' own eyes, he stood aghast as the GIs proudly displayed bags full of gold teeth. That is a quote. Also much raw material. Similarly, Paul Virilio underlines John Armitage, who wrote the introduction to Art and Fear, manages to imagine that Virilio found this a concern because of his French Catholicism. The human tissue extracted from fetuses had already in Auschwitz been an object for research, that is, material remains, now deployed to this day in many ways, not only in vaccines, not only given the ongoing pharmaceutical mobilization efforts to inoculate the world. Such industrial production is the manufacture, as Heidegger infamously says, of corpses. Tacitly, Anders's language is less ex cathedra, more concrete, as Anders speaks of cannibalism, that word I just quoted, to observe the anthropic temerity of our modern technological age as a merely logical result of regarding the world as raw material, either to be used heedlessly or conserved in some Green New Deal. Both visions assume the human at the center. This is Anders. This terrible general license which renders nothing taboo apart from the human, and which assumes that everything has been created for the human, that is, that everything is at his disposal, has never existed apart from the monotheistic domain of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And he quotes Genesis, a very good theological scholar, neither in the systems of the Magi nor in the multifarious systems of polytheism. Only, he continues, there's a bit I leave out here, in the framework of the anthropocentric tradition in which the world was regarded as subordinated, think of the word dominion in English, to the human being as servant, object, and means of survival, and in which the human, although still creatura, was not regarded as part of nature, but as unlimited lord of all creation, solely within this frame could natural science arise, and with it technology, and with it, finally, industrialism. And of course, Nietzsche makes a similar case. Just as Judeo-Christian monotheistic religion is a humanism, modern technoscience is a humanism. Second section, anthropologism and psychologism. Isms, whether analytic or continental style, do not tend to be good things. Thus, the reproof of anthropologism follows like the cognate charge of psychologism from Gottlob Frege's admonition sharply to separate the psychological from the logical, the subjective from the objective. Frege echoes Kant, who distinguishes his own inquiry into practical reason from anthropology, Kant famously does this, as from, same time, what belongs to a science properly, authentically said. As opposed to anthropology, Heidegger emphasizes the being question itself as what he calls the task of laying bare that a priori, very important Kant reference here, basis which must be visible before the question of what man is can be discussed philosophically. For Heidegger, the analytic of Dasein precedes anthropological questions. Nevertheless, as we know, Husserl accuses Heidegger of anthropologism. The accusation accords with the so-called existentialist misunderstanding of being and time, as Rainer Schormann explains specifically French existentialism as a movement which developed out of the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre, featuring Husserlian elements along with, I quote, Schormann, themes from being and time, being towards death, dread, etc., developing them into a so-called ontology of human existence. That's Schormann. By contrast, for Schormann, in Being in Time, Heidegger is preoccupied with the question of being as such, whatever that will turn out to mean, and only therefore with the question of Dasein. I'd add that in addition to the ontological, Heidegger raises the science question. To my mind, it matters that Nietzsche first raises the question of science as a question, and Heidegger, in addition to his focus on questioning in being and time, raises the specific question of the human sciences, the Geisteswissenschaften, noting that these depend for their data, their least interpreted facts, as it were, upon a pre-given foundational conception of that same science itself. But heretofore, he says, and Greg Fried will recognize this, our information about primitives has been provided by ethnology. And ethnology operates with definite preliminary conceptions and interpretations of human Dasein in general, even in first receiving its material and in sifting it and working it up. There we have some of our Spokane Indians as our friends of ethnography, what they would be, who they would be. Whether the everyday, the quote continues, psychology or even the scientific psychology and sociology with the ethnologist brings with him can provide any scientific assurance that we can have proper access to the phenomena we're studying and can interpret them and transmit them in the right way. This is the hermeneutic question of the social sciences, has not yet been established. That's what he says in 1927. Thus, the point Heidegger makes regarding anthropology is focused on human Dasein as the forehaving that frames specifically scientific questioning presupposes a defining orientation such that anthropology requires hermeneutic phenomenology. Ethnology, Heidegger says, itself already presupposes as its clue an inadequate analytic of Dasein. And then there's a whole philosophy of science you would kind of have to shovel in here in order to be able to begin to unpack that. If Dasein is that entity which in its being has this very being as an issue, as we all know, should Dasein be limited to the human? It seems so. What else is Dasein? Who else is Dasein other than the human? If I would argue for animal Dasein, as for alien Dasein, as do Hume, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, and Friedrich Nietzsche, they all make a case for that. And if others might argue for rock and, I think I have that there, robot Dasein, Schurman underlines that the human informs traditional metaphysics, ideology, religious sensibility. As Anders underlines the point, good student of philosophical anthropology that Anders was, only human beings are able to be Dasein, the there of being. There is thus an or-humanism in advance of any question concerning the human. For this reason, Heidegger opens the question reflecting on mine-ness, the I, myself, self of Dasein, the subject of his interrogation of the same preoccupation of Dasein with the issue of its own being. For Schurman, most readings locate being and time within the tradition of the philosophy of subjectivity. That's what most people do. And such readings read Being and Time as a book not about being, capitalized or not, and not about time, but about Dasein. Thus, on Schurman's count, he says, of the 83 sections of Being and Time, 75 deal with an analysis of what Heidegger calls Dasein, for which there seems to be no English equivalent. It's at the New School, so obviously he's saying that with a certain sneer, emphasizing that Heidegger's concern is the Seinsfrage. Schurman hardly argues that Heidegger's Being and Time offers an anthropology. Rather, Schurman highlights a point Heidegger makes for his own part, as Heidegger thereby seeks to raise not the Dasein question per se, but the being question per se. But simply given the bulk of Being and Time, given those same 75 fairly systematically articulated sections, the point of departure in Heidegger's first 8 sections tends to be more or less forgotten. Thus, and now we get to the slide that you've been looking at, there are not two Heideggers. Taking Heidegger at his word, contra Bill Richardson's convention of a Heidegger 1 and a Heidegger 2. Here, I follow Schurman to the extent that he emphasizes that what's at stake in Being and Time is not philosophical anthropology. Articulated as an advance on Husserlian phenomenology, Heidegger offers a hermeneutic phenomenology. Thus, phenomenology can be formulated in Greek as legein ta phenomena, but legein means apophenistai. Hence, phenomenology means apophenistai ta phenomena, to let what shows itself be seen from itself, just as it shows itself. Allowing what shows itself to be seen from itself is also to consider what's concealed, or non-evident, and this includes ontology. As Heidegger also explains, only as phenomenology is ontology possible, just to the extent that there remain various ways phenomena, this is a quote, can be covered up. Arguing that the methodological meaning of phenomenological description is interpretation, Heidegger writes that the logos of the phenomenological character of Dasein has the character of hemeneuein, which is to say that hermeneutics, quote, works out the condition of the possibility of every ontological investigation. Section 3, the transhuman condition. One may vary Nietzsche's reflections that what belongs to what is human, all too human, is a focus on the human. This self-turned focus includes transhumanism, as it is also all about modern technology. To this same extent, a focus on engineered or gain of function or transhuman beings reflects our Promethean shame, a term Anders uses to articulate our tendency in a concretization of alienation to compare ourselves with the things we have made, and finding ourselves lacking, to seek to be reborn in and as transhuman. Above, I cited, there's a very, very strong claim, Anders' observation that our religious legacy offers humanistic license for destruction on a global scale. We have dominion. Thus, Anders cites Nietzsche's definition of the human as the unfinished animal. That is, those animals who do not regard themselves as animals, animals imago Dei, who suppose that the universe itself was either specifically designed for them or for us by deity, or can be made so in technological effect, whatever the cost. Here we may think of geoengineering both in past, because geoengineering has been going on for some time, and current practice. Just a bit before, I noted that as Dasein would include others, like aliens and like animals, at least is my understanding. But by contrast, Anders remains closer to the humanist Heidegger, despite his numerous attacks on Heidegger. For Anders, nature is ontologically ordered to Dasein for Heidegger, emphasizing further on the level of embodiment that Heidegger's analysis in Being in Time, that should have been italicized, despite its explicit focus on being in the world, and Jill had a lovely talk on this some time ago, and there have been several essays published on this going back several years, leaves out, rather than brackets, questions of hunger or sex, noting in the process that all want is wanting. Now, the reference to transhumanism, the prospect of hacking the human, using the term hacking to make it seem a casual venture done on the fly by tech geeks, harmless and all that, and as some seek to do in order to extend life, Aubrey de Grey style, Ray Kurzweil style, via genetic engineering, is to ambition the same ongoing enterprise, unbroken, since Anders spoke of human engineering in his 1956 book. But in his lecture course, not a course, just a single one-off lecture, just in Meskirk one time for Conradin Kreutzer, Gelassenheit, given 1 year before Anders publishes his book on the 10-year anniversary of Hiroshima, which is when Gelassenheit was held, Heidegger argued, 1955, that the project of human engineering via biochemistry made matters such as the deployment of atom bombs, to the banning of which Anders would dedicate his life, trivial by comparison. Heidegger there references yet another Bodensee conference, an international meeting, I'm quoting Heidegger, of Nobel Prize winners, end quote. Quoting, Wendell Stanley's remarks on the ability to synthesize, split, and change living substance at will. That's just a little altered, that translation. And we can add that at that meeting, Stanley, the winner of the 1946 Nobel Prize for Chemistry, addressed his fellow scientists on the state of competition that had changed science. Stanley's research, you might not remember, or you might remember, I learned this when I was a biology student many, many years ago, was fundamental for GMO agri-tech to this day. We kind of need this, with his crystallization of the tobacco mosaic virus in 1935. From the life of open exchange, this is what Stanley's complaining about, between scientists, to the changes inaugurated by Jonas Salk and the competition surrounding the poliomyelitis virus and the attempts to find a safe vaccine. That's Wendell Stanley. Thus, in Lindau, to quote one historian of science's paraphrase of Stanley's report, during the race for a polio vaccine, and Bruno Latour writes about this as well, the results of the research were only judged by committees, this can sound very familiar, behind closed doors. As a consequence, there were some serious mistakes made, and for some time, a vaccine was used, in particular on children, which actually resulted in paralysis. For Heidegger, we may note that the language of thoughtlessness is one we recognize. Heidegger says, we marvel at the daring of scientific research without thinking about it. We do not stop to consider that an attack with technological means is being prepared upon the life and nature of the human being, compared with which the explosion of the hydrogen bomb means, that's the quote we just hinted at earlier, little. For precisely, if the hydrogen bombs do not explode and human life is preserved, an uncanny change in the world moves upon us. Note that in addition to the thoughtlessness we may associate with science, which manifestly does not think, Heidegger invokes the uncanny, das Unheimliche, a term emphasized in his discussion of the human in his introduction to metaphysics, claiming again and again that the human is to denotaton, the strangest of the strange. The Greek is necessary, even though I've transposed this into Roman Latin letters. Speaking of Sophocles as Heidegger is, as Sophocles inspires Alexander Pope's essay on man. As Pope tells us ourselves in English, no translation needed, placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great. Following the steps and turns, the rhythm of the lines and tacks of Sophocles' first chorus in Antigone, Pope can seem to be predicting geoengineering. Go, wondrous creature, mount where science guides, go measure earth, weigh air, and state the tides, instruct the planets in what orbs to run, correct old time, and regulate the sun. Clearly, as far back as Pope's 1734, what we now call the science ruled the day. Students of the history and philosophy of science know that what counts as science changes. Heidegger asks his own question on humanism in his Gelassenheit lecture, wondering about the possibility of a new ground and foundation in what can seem to be void. Here, for Heidegger, for everyone actually should also be quoting always the same Kant, who begins his first critique, we all read this, by reminding us of the air against which the dove's wings flail and climb, but which, absent that same elastic air, couldn't fly at all. Thus the question, and unlike some of the other speakers, this is for me not Heidegger's prescription or dictate, but a real question of whether humanity does Menschenwesen and all its works can flourish in a new way, Heidegger seems to ask, says he asks, even in the atomic age. Heidegger knew that Hölderlin, who knew Kant's allusion to the dove, of course they were at the same time, held to another element than air, the aether, as to another standard. These are the Greeks, as Hölderlin writes to his brother on New Year's Day, 1779, comparing his own stumbling efforts, as he says, to these only human beings in the world. Those are the Greeks. And in what I do and say, I am often only the more inept and inconsistent because I stand like geese with my flat feet in modern water and helplessly beat my wings up to the Greek sky. On the uncanny, to denotaton. So what's the human? Sophocles tells us, like Hölderlin, including water and wind, that there is much that is strange, but nothing that surpasses man, the human being, in strangeness. He sets sail on the frothing waters amid the south winds of winter. Heidegger writes Mensch in his own text, no talk of Dasein, as the Greek begins politadein. As Heidegger repeats the first point to be emphasized, there is much that is strange to describe the human as strange or uncanny, kudein anthropou de noteron. Sophocles moves between positive encomium and drastic warning, to and fro in the meter, and he has found his way to the resonance of the word phlegma, and to windswift all understanding phronema, and to the courage of rule over cities, astutnomus. To read this, we need to read as Heidegger reads the Greek. And we need to do this because Sophocles, if you were reading the Greek, does what he does in his ode, varying the chained conjunction kai. The question of the human is posed contra today's attunement to the transhumanism that reads itself as a kind of überhumanism, not unlike Heidegger's parenthetical dismissal, reminding us that among, quote, the Greeks, this is Heidegger, there were no personalities, and for this reason, no super-personality, Überpersönliches. Overcoming, überwinden, as Anders varies Nietzsche's word, turns on still more concrete affairs. What's at stake today is the medicalized, attested, more disciplined than Foucault ever imagined, via masking, submitted to the violating of the body via testing, and the ordeals of the same, cleared and registered, flagged and marked, tracked and certified, and infused to the level of the blood itself via vaccine, the body. The attention to the human, the urge to overcome or re-engineer the body is not quite or utterly modern or postmodern, as it may be found in what Nietzsche in The Gay Science called the preludes to science. That's all that strange, magical stuff. That's Faust. Just as it holds sway in modern technoscience as such, all gene-modified and CRISPRed, as we anticipate the results of the new experimental vaccine meant to change the human body and reset a world in crisis. And the effort succeeds. Most of us have by now been tested, some of us many, many times, with PCR tests, with all the nanotech bits I wanted to leave out, just as many of us have been vaccinated, which is to say, perhaps we're a little less the human element, which is at least then factically post-human and standardized as masks standardize, as Giorgio Agamben has most recently pointed out in the Zürcher Zeitung, faceless as we are in the street, the classroom, the synagogue, or the church, re-inhaling our own breaths to the detriment of our blood CO2 levels and quite beneath conscious awareness. Heidegger's claim in Gelassenheit is thus quite in tension with its title, Letting Be, which I'm very sorry for people who are impressed with French translations, does not mean serenity. To the extent that, I already quoted this, an attack is being prepared on the life and nature of the human being if we survive. Fill in any blank you like. If we survive climate change, overpopulation, Bill Gates, surveillance, AI, Heidegger says that an uncanny change moves upon us. Now, I have written about all of this for many years, and it is all so boring. This too is mortality, and is likely what Aquinas meant, as Bill Richardson liked to repeat throughout his own life, sic ut palia, it's all straw. Conclusion, it's very short. The technological rescue cannot but leave us. This is the old way of new technology, which brings us back to hermeneutic technoscience with new problems to be discovered at our leisure, and perhaps, who can say, in the absence of what had been the human, whose essential nature it had been to walk. As Michel de Certeau argues, going to and fro in one's corner of the world, or up and down the earth, as Lingus argues in his phenomenological anthropology of being upright for hominids like ourselves, breathing freely or risking, as Rilke says, as Heidegger quotes the being that dares us, es wagt uns, immeasurably beyond what Giorgio Agamben calls bare life. In our connivance, I use, with my Dr. Vater, Jacques Tamanio's French English, in that we go with this risking, this risk, this daring, Wagnis, as Heidegger reflects, unpacking Rilke's improvised verses, repeating, that's what Heidegger does. It is his Heideggerian want again and again, except that we, more eager than plant or beast, go with this venture, will it. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry, I'm not finished. I screwed up again. There you go. Never mind. I'm almost done. We need more gloss. It would be a cute ending, but it's just where my text ended. The we refers to our creaturely being, as Heidegger claims, the language between Hölderlin and Rilke on the danger for humanity, endangered in his nature. That's the quote here. This daring is no more given, and this is maybe bring us back to the connection on authenticity that we were talking about just before, for our shared human Dasein, than is Heidegger's Eigentlichkeit. Even after Heidegger, even after Agamben, we still need to think the open Rilke's unshieldedness. And that's the last quote. So that's what we need to try and think. That's a very strange picture of Rilke, but that's what he did look like. It's very unfortunate, but that is what he looked like. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Babette. And now, applause. Very good. And now I'd like to introduce you to Dan Bradley, who's a professor at Gonzaga University and has prepared some remarks for us. And Dan, that's a hard act to follow, but I'm sure you're going to do great.
Well, thank you, John. It is indeed. It's really a pleasure to respond to Professor Babich's work. They wash over one. And I think there is something about this daring to go beyond that's embodied in Babich's way of speaking. So I'm grateful that she did. Babette was kind enough to send me her paper early, so I have a few written remarks, a way to kind of get a handle on something. As always, Babich brings out the emotive force or the lived experience of the philosophical questions at stake in a very existentially moving way. She speaks of manufacture of corpses and of cannibalism, among many other things. I think this evocatively points to what I take to be a truth, namely that the absolute distinction made in modernity between human beings and all other things cannot hold. Once the entirety of the non-human world is turned into mere raw material, we cannot hold back the tide of horror. The wall is breached, and it soon overruns our humanity as well. Thus, as David Wood pointed out yesterday, even a humanism, if it's enlightened at all, must put a great priority on going beyond the human. I think this is what draws many people to Heidegger's work, particularly in light of questions about environmental ethics, which would hope to be not merely applied philosophy, but also a call to rearticulate, rediscover the value of the non-human world. Our conversation over the last couple of days has already been swirling around this hope and its attendant renewal of attention to physis, to nature, however inadequate that word, and materiality, however also inadequate that word. There are ontological and hermeneutical questions, these, precisely because of the inadequacies of the way that they were dealt with in modern philosophy. But Babich points out in this talk that this desire to get outside the human is certainly not new with Heidegger. And I think that that is worth remembering. When we tell the story of the rise of modernity, our account often hinges on understanding Descartes as seeking meaning in the face of the rise of Galilean science and seeking certainty in the face of the turbulence of the 17th century, and finding answers to both those desires in the turn to the subject. With these two hermeneutic keys in hand, Heidegger looks quite postmodern with his anti-foundationalism and his critique of the mathematization of nature. But when we take up as our hermeneutic key the desire to escape the human tendency to project fantasies and illusions onto reality, Heidegger looks much more modern. As Babich notes, the critique of humanism is already fully formulated in Frege's admonition to sharply separate the psychological from the logical, the subjective from the objective. And before that, it's evident in Kant himself. I would just add that this emphasis on escaping the illusions by which we falsify reality, by projecting our desires and fears, our humanity, upon it, is also present in Descartes and even more so in Locke. Locke ends the first volume of an essay concerning human understanding with a whole litany of ways in which we can misunderstand things by seeing them in a foreign, that is, in a human, light. Locke's first example is that of the nursery tale. The ideas of goblins and sprites, he tells us, have really no more to do with darkness than with light. Yet let but a foolish maid inculcate these often in the mind of a child and raise them there together, possibly he shall never be able to separate them again so long as he lives. Now there's a parallel between the derogation of the nursery maid's tale and the old wives' tale that Trish mentioned. That's very un-Heideggerian. But I think the general worry about distorting and falsifying reality with the accumulation of our fantastical constructs and the attendant desire to clear away the accumulated clutter is very Heideggerian. This is why he's attracted to the critique of metaphysics in Luther very early, and then later in Nietzsche, and they use similar language to that of Locke. If modernity is understood as a preoccupation with the way human beings project their fantasies and illusions onto reality, and the desire to clear away that clutter, Heidegger remains deeply modern. So what's the difference between Locke and Heidegger? In fact, are we not dealing with such a general feature of the human condition, namely illusion, that we're just talking about philosophy itself? Well, I would want to say, and I do think this is a Heideggerian claim, that in purging values in the broadest sense from the non-human world, modernity was able to avoid anthropomorphism, but only at the price of a radical anthropocentrism. We avoided projecting our values onto reality by forbidding ourselves from discovering any values in the natural world at all. Another way to say this is that the critique of alienation is the very beginning of overcoming nihilism. The first glimmer of dawn in Marx, even before Nietzsche, and maybe even in Hegel, as Heidegger hints at in On the Origin of the Work of Art. Thus, it's the anti-humanism in modernity that needs to be overcome. An anti-humanism rooted in an overzealous iconoclasm that wants to keep truth totally pure from human contact. This iconoclasm is only healed by the rehabilitation of mediation. And I think we get one important contribution to this project from Babich in this essay, as she calls on Augustine to speak of presence as proximity, both temporal and ontological, but only while using the key of logical proximity to make sense of these more ontological claims. That logical proximity, she tells us, is constituted by concrete presence, but also by coincident proximity. Concrete presence as presence is the revelation of intimacy, but as concrete, there's a mutual openness, opaqueness of the other in a relation between two. Relatedly, coincident immediacy is not the immediacy of self-presence. As immediacy, there is an intimacy that overcomes alienation. In this intimacy, to posit an unbridgeable gap between self and other is unthinkable. For the multiplicity of the two is intimately interwoven in the experience of a shared reality, that which is coincident. But neither can it be reduced to the self-presence of a transparent idea, for there's an irreducible two-ness that also calls for ongoing relation, for movement, for creative self-giving. In other words, it's a non-iconoclastic and non-fusional understanding of immediacy, one that opens to and welcomes all kinds of mediations. So let me just return to the theme of the conference, and I'll end with a general suggestion that is too vague to be a helpful question for you, Babette, but maybe more of a research project for myself. Namely, that this coincident immediacy makes an important contribution to the rehabilitation of mediation that will allow a rejection of instrumental environmentalism, but also a rejection of the tendencies towards anti-humanism in some versions of deep ecology that would see preservation of wilderness, for example, as really the only priority for environmental philosophy. So positively, while keeping in mind all of Heidegger's critiques of voluntarism, the harsh language he uses for Marx later on, and so on, this helps a Heideggerian philosophy escape its residual modern iconoclasm and to open onto a humanist celebration of human creativity and of a confidence in the human ability to discover goodness in the non-human world as part of a Heideggerian-inspired environmental philosophy, but also as part of a Heideggerian-inspired resistance to the less helpful elements of posthumanism. Thank you, Babette.
Thank you, Dan. We are technically at the end of the session, but we're also the last session, and it would be a shame not to have a conversation about this. So I'm going to use the power of the moderator to open things up for a while longer. Babette, do you want to respond to Dan before we open questions? You're on mute. Babette, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm grateful for what Dan said, but there's not something that I can respond to in what he said, as Dan
Okay.
said himself.
Very good. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Babette or for Dan? Comments, editorial remarks?
I guess I'll go. I didn't
you.
use the hand emoji. I'm sorry.
Jill, you used your actual hand, which is just as good.
My actual embodied. Thanks, Babette. Whenever I hear you speak, I feel like I have a whirlwind of questions. It's really hard to form a question from A to B. So I'm just gonna read off some of my notes here. Like my brain was really going when you were talking about Anders, and it's been a while since I read that essay on his critique of Heidegger's pseudo-concreteness. But I remember when he had, defined time as this lapse between our desiring and perceiving of an object and our appropriating of that. And of course, we know Heidegger, being and time are really intricate related. So my question is kind of, well, where does that want come from? And I mean, for Heidegger, he talks about this call of conscience. And my notes are like, it's like a crazy person on here. But you had mentioned Gelassenheit and letting be. So I think that some Heidegger scholars, and they do interpret it as this theological stance that we should just, it's God's will. And you bring this back to today, we shouldn't mask, we shouldn't, vaccinate. I'm not saying you personally have a religious stance, but I think some people do, it's God's will. But so too do the transhumanists. I saw you bury your hands, but I know this is a very half-baked question. As I said, I should show you my ransom notes here that I'm writing out. But I mean, transhumanists, how do we separate them, from, religion? If you read their text, they think that technology comes from God. And you could easily see how they could, if they wanted to, appropriate Heidegger's Gelassenheit and say, well, we're just carrying out God's will of using this technology. So through all this, I'm kind of asking you, well, what do you think the right path is? From your other work, I would, confidently say that you are very critical of transhumanists. You don't think we should use this technology. But then if we don't, then don't you presume a kind of universal call of conscience, or think that the right call of conscience? And what are all these, tricky questions that come with that? Again, this isn't a question, but an open,
Thank you, Jill. I think that's a very real and an urgent question. And one of the difficulties, at least for me, is that we tend to think that we have humanism on one side and transhumanism on the other. And there's no way that that is true. So posthumanism, humanism, transhumanism, they're all humanism. And the problem with that is we are always in our own way. So there's no way we're not going to do whatever we like. We are going to. The problem is thinking about what that means and what follows from that. And that's where we can have all kinds of arguments. People say, oh, we have to do that. That was something that Casey said earlier. We're just going to have to do geoengineering. Indeed, we are, and we already are. And so it's something very, I mean, it's a very strange thing. And I tend not to listen to anyone who talks about climate change, who doesn't talk about the changing of the climate that has been going on for quite some time, so long that I began my career in philosophy at Marquette, which is to me the Midwest because it's Wisconsin, and pilots who had come back from Vietnam, because that was that time at the end of the 80s, had been already for a decade seeding clouds with techniques they learned to control the weather for Midwest farmers. It's on command. So, and that was then. So you have a tremendous transformation. It's not that people are about to not use these techniques. It is almost impossible for us sitting here as academics to imagine the extent to which this is already being done and has been done for quite some time. My background is in biology. It's what I started to do. It's what I wanted to do until they, you have to guillotine little hamsters, and that was not a good thing. But it is not the case that we don't treat everything on the earth as stuff for us to use. It's so crucial and so important to think about. But we think, well, we have to because we must survive. And we smuggle in our own self-imposition. Selbstbehauptung is that very complicated German word, which means more than what we are saying in English with self-assertion. We put ourselves front and center at the head of everything, and everything else can just line up to the left. We're not really worried if all of what David Wood said beautifully, if all these species die and we don't know that they even existed, doesn't really bother us. We're happy that we haven't seen bugs in years. I hate bugs, but where are they? It's a very, very important problem. You used to find all kinds of strange creatures, in the parking lot and, in your bathroom and others. And some people may still have these problems, God bless you. But in other places, absolutely not. So you have an overall entomological decrease in mass that is now, according to the Germans who bother to measure, down by 70%. That's of insect mass. That's huge. That's so huge. It should really freak us out, but we don't see it. And that's, of course, the problem. But thank you so much for that question. Hard question. Thank you, Joe.
Bob Scharf. Don't forget
Just
to
a quick,
unmute.
just a quick remark about humanism and transhumanism, both being humanisms. I have a bone that I like to pick with a lot of people that's similar to that, and that is the idea that science is value free. It's not anything of the sort. It's the representative of a whole set of very definite values. It is mathematics loving, science oriented, tends to be liberal individualist in its orientation. It believes in free will. All of these things come from Descartes' Meditations as part of what it is to be a meditator, part of what it is to be philosophizing about the quest for knowledge, or anything that we're going to do with knowledge according to the tree of knowledge. So it's difficult to understand where you are if you refuse to take part of where you are with you by saying, no, I'm dealing with values now instead of with science. It's a mistake, and it's very costly.
Yes, I agree.
I thought you would.
That's fair.
Thank you. We have a question from Shirin Elkoli.
Hi, Babette.
Hi, Shep.
So I'd like to ask you to,
I can't hear you.
if that's because I'm not saying anything. So assuming that we're not so uprooted as Heidegger might wish us to return back to from or move to, so we're not divorced from, say, historical ways of living, or uprooted from communities, or being with one another in authentic ways. I wonder if the fact that those things are not existing anymore, and we could see that very clearly now with the way we've all isolated ourselves starkly, if that also somehow leads us to fail to question the way that we're being inoculated, or the transhuman modes that we for so long have been living under without any sort of concern or question. I wonder if there's a relationship between sort of inauthentic living and failing to question or even see a problem, and how maybe returning to some sort of more authentic way of life would allow us to actually be afraid and be concerned, and in what way that might look.
That's a very hard question. Shireen, I think one of the interesting things about the current lockdown is that it simply couldn't have worked if we had not already moved ourselves and our consciousness online. So one of the beautiful things about what Heidegger teaches us is really, and that's the hermeneutic sense, and that is also from Husserl. They're together on this, and Anders, of course, is even more intense about it. We are projecting constantly. And when people describe these Zoom events of this kind, and we had that earlier, today before lunch and so on, where the whole thing just disappears and it's over and you're not there, that this tremendous contact and tiny passing connection that we have with one another because of our presence that is false, not really real, that had already been established. I like to call it the porn effect, right? Because people, especially men, manage to spend an inordinate amount of time online doing things they perhaps should not have been doing and certainly didn't want their wives or children to know about, but which, and this is why there's just the other day, don't use your work computer for private affairs. Why? Because that's what you do. And it's a serious problem. So our trouble is we're set up for an authentic condition by something that was absolutely captivating to us. My books are at home in New York. I'm here because of my husband in England. I'm dedicated to trying to find fanciful representations called Google Books of books that I own, and try to figure out by all of the power of Einbildungskraft what that page looked like by a bad version of someone else's copy that's not the edition I own. It's very, very difficult. You retro work a PDF back to a book if you've known the book. And if you've never read the book, I have no idea what you do. I think it's a very, very difficult thing indeed. But my answer to you is to say it's worse than we think, because we already did it. And we were already there. We had already trotted out into the World Wide Web, to the online search for love, search for eros, search for copies of my books, things like that. And we are therefore not, because that's the way the consciousness works. One of the things about consciousness, and that's where I do think the talk we heard this morning, Agostino's point, which, straight from Naples, was a great point, that an engineer could do it better. But exactly there's a complete accuracy. You cannot divide your consciousness. You think you can, but you cannot. And I think that's a very, very important point, because if you were to attempt, and we do think we multitask, every empirical study that we have tells us that it can't be done. So we, however, and we're doing this right now, and I did this trying to listen, trying to do other things. It's completely impossible. There's no recommendation to say, let's go and have a more authentic life, do digital Sabbaths and so on and so forth, because we are in lockdown. And so one of the problems, and some places are more open than others, and some people have access to a certain amount of travel, even if going to vacations and beaches is not big on the list, not at least if you want to go somewhere via plane. So there are problems which can't be ameliorated by a resolution regarding philosophy, because you have a real and you would call it totalitarian if you were to use that language, and you should, because, of course, every single country in the world is doing this, and someone should think about that.
Thank you for that.
Dan Bradley.
Thanks, Babette. Your response there, I think, is very interesting. We tend to date this you're right that we could not have done this if we hadn't already been pre-adapted and pre-formed for this online living. And we tend to date this to 2007 and the beginning of the social media on the smartphone. But the reference to pornography suggests something about the impersonal, which is much more akin to film and to television. There's a kind of virtual presence that exists not just in the social, but in the entertainment. And so I'm wondering how you think that virtual presence is so much more harmful than the virtual temporal presence of writing that, you know, Plato talks about all the way back at the beginning, that you can cross time virtually with a written letter in a way that we've never been able to cross space virtually until very recently, with mass transmissions of television and with cinema. And so what do you think it is that's so much more destructive about the virtual spatial presencing as opposed to the temporal presencing of writing?
I think, and I'm very guilty because I don't give a talk, because I always feel bad that people probably won't ask questions or probably won't like what I've said. So I always put, you know, PowerPoint so that they have something else to look at, you know, and so that they don't have to listen. I therefore play with a kind of multitasking and a kind of ADD and distraction as part. I also believe that that can allow something to come through one way or another, and it can therefore be helpful. That's one of the points about it. But the other thing, and actually I wrote a book on this called The Hallelujah Effect, which is about the porn effect. That's what it's about. And one of the problems, and it's something that I was shocked by my own students, because I'm totally not with it. You know, other people are, I am not. And I listen therefore to what my students say, because they know. And of course, one of the things that the younger students were saying a couple of, just 2 years ago, we were still meeting in person, was that they had completely given up the internet. And they had complete societies of individuals who refused masturbation. And I thought, how odd, the new monasticism. That's a very, very intriguing thing. But my own research in the Hallelujah Effect, and there are footnotes on it, and you can go look at them, and there are even more now, pointed out that one of the things that happens is that overcharge of the ADD effect, that overcharge of this effect and that effect, and so on and so forth, so that you become too much. It's one of the reasons dating apps don't work for women. They work for men, but they don't work for women. Why? Because as soon as a man finds a match, he's like, there's got to be a better one at the next, you know, swipe, and so on and so forth. And so he looks and he looks and he looks. And it's a male psyche. This is a very strange, this is what Trish Gray's book was saying earlier, but there may be something to that I don't really know. But one of the things that I do know is that may be the male psyche, but men can't handle it. It's a very, very important point. They burn out. And so there are serious consequences of, in some cases, permanent impotence, a complete loss of functionality that Viagra cannot fix, and so on and so forth. So that you can, especially for, and this was one of the scarier effects, depending upon how old you are when you discover the internet, you can or cannot recover. If you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s, when you discover this very bad habit, you can get over it. You know, whatever is Al-Anon or no sex anon, whatever they call it. But if you're under 17, that is not the case. And so one of the serious problems is that we develop biologically, and our way of being and projecting ourselves change, and our capacity for response change, and overexcitement overcharges all kinds of things. Not quite in the way that the monks and other sorts talked about this. Ivan Illich writes about his Jesuit teachers telling him, you know, but it's not about that. You know, that if you that concupiscence comes through the eyes. You know, that's Illich himself, and he's worth reading, and people don't read him, but he's worth reading. And if you look at that, then I think what you need to do is bring your own understanding. That's what Shireen was asking. Other sciences to bear, and then you understand more about why the response changes and why the ability to respond changes. In point of fact, it's in the first 2 chapters of Marcuse's book. If you don't read Eros and Civilization, it's already there, because Eros can be the world or it can be your laptop. And so one of the big problems with the laptop is you prime yourself to sit down in front of this, and there are things you automatically do because well, free association, literal association, habit, same sort of thing. Thank you, Dan. Maybe someone will read the Hallelujah Effect. I don't know. That'd be nice.
Very good. Any Trish Glazebach?
Hi, thanks, Babette. That's fascinating. And I always, sometimes when you talk, I don't ask questions after, because I find that there's just too much for me to process in that short of a time. But really, after, I've heard you talk and read things that you've written that take us to this place of, it's true, right? By the time we figure out what's going on, it's already got us. We're well trapped in it, right? By the time we identify it, it's because we do some little thing that allows, and this "we" is weird here, but certainly allows the human experience as we know it in the global north to be this already done, and we're already trapped in it. So what are we doing now then? Are we simply documenting that? Are we simply recording the end? Are we in any way able to intervene? Is there any possibility of a new beginning, or of something that, something that overcomes this overwhelming understanding that, Heidegger also said we should give up all overcoming and just leave it to work itself out, right? That we just, he said metaphysics, right? Just leave metaphysics to itself. So, where do we go from here? Where are we headed? We as a species, we as those who are alive on the planet now. How do I deal with my child who wants to, my son just wants to play video games for 10 hours a day with his friends, and that's not a good thing. But at the same time, it's this completely different communication and interaction system. So on the one hand, it's bleak. On the other hand, it is a very new way of doing things that in their experience, for them, it's a future, right? It's not a bleak loss of anything or a threat. It's simply that they have ways of talking to each other that we don't have. So, I see it as an entrapment. What do you think? Are we just describing the end, or is there some possible future?
No. One of the beauties of contingency is that anything can happen. That's what it means. So the real world can go any way that we like, but there is right now, there are rules that in my life I have never encountered before, and they are everywhere, and one should think about that more than we are. One of the things we have is an enormous compliance, an enormous complicity, where one thinks, okay, I'll just do whatever they ask me to do, and then they'll ease up, which is nonsense. Because that is not how that works. The more you do, the more they realize you will do. So that's something that's a scary point. I quoted my students though, because I believe that they are right. I think there are ways to have and not have. We have constant reports. College kids are having less sex than people, but there are reasons for that. So if you listen to what they're saying, they're responding to certain difficulties in a hookup culture, a different kind of relationship, which is also a lot less rule-bound than people used to imagine it to be, and so on. So you have to actually have open eyes to see what different cultures are doing, because there's a tribe of people, they're young, and they don't respect you. And they are not really talking to you. But occasionally they will say a few things and you can see what's going on. That's the future. You're not part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think Eugen Fink is astonishing about that. And again, he's someone we all managed not to read because he published in the 50s when we didn't read anything. And one of the reasons that I mentioned the students is because they have things that they also automatically practice. So what you say, I'm in correspondence often with the gaming designer, had a couple of online, and he wants to talk to me again, which won't go well. But in any case, that very, very different understanding. And my student was, of course, the author of Reality is Broken, Jane McGonigal, in one of my classes at Fordham University. She doesn't argue as I do, but nonetheless got some ideas and went certain ways. There's an awful lot that's there in the gaming. The danger of the gaming is that it takes away the sky. And I don't know how you're ever going to say, oh no, but you really still have that. No, you don't. Every one of us has worked on a project where we sit down, fix something. Some idiot tells us to correct our website. I haven't updated my website in years. I just don't have time for the Fordham website. I have other things to do. Time vanishes. Again, that Zoom effect. So you lose this complete consciousness and you lose the sky. And that's where that notion of Rilke's open that really preoccupies Heidegger. Heidegger hates Rilke. Why does he engage so much with Rilke and that particular Schutzlossein? We have lived now more than a year not being Schutzlos. And once upon a time, this group, these Heideggerians, would have been the first people to understand and give me lessons back on what that means. And now, of course, we're like, well, no, you really have to be protected and you have to wear a mask and you have to do all kinds of other things. And Agamben is the only person to raise any questions. And what happened to Agamben? Major mocking, right? You know, Agamben. And you have to imagine what that is. You get to be the top of your game in philosophy, the best. And then suddenly everybody's saying, he's nobody. Why? Because he said, should we not bury our dead? It's a very good question. And of course, who minds that they don't have to visit grandma? Not a problem.
But it's not true that we never followed any rules before, though. And now we're just these little sheep that say, give me another rule, please, because, you know, I want to follow another one. I mean, we all stop at red lights, right? And we all wear seatbelts. And I remember a big hoo-ha about whether we should wear seatbelts or not. And there are regular debates about whether people on motorcycles should wear helmets. And, you know, we stop at red lights because it's something that allows us to not kill each other, right? And I know we've argued about this quite a bit in the past year, but I mean, you can look at the countries that aren't able to do, you know, India's problem is that it just can't do social distancing because there's too much poverty of people living so close together, right? So, you know,
you have a very good point. And in the few times that I've been back to New York, I have seen the homeless people, and there are homeless in Winchester, and there are homeless in London. They didn't protect themselves, and I assure you they did not die. There are empirical checks which we are not doing and could do and should do, and especially the homeless should be a group that we should pay attention to, not just our own students because they pay huge amounts of money to our universities, but also the homeless. And one of the things in New York City was that the homeless were so far from being affected by COVID and perishing from COVID that they simply took over the New York City subway system to the extent that a system that ran every 24 hours all of my life, now it has a last metro as in Paris. It stops and does not run all night. And that is because of the homeless and what they did, because they did not die. And they were Schutzlos.
Did you have data
So to me, you need to bring in a few other questions and other issues. I don't believe one should drive through red lights, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be rules of any kind. I am talking about rather more than that.
Much, much more than that. And you're not talking about it in the ridiculous freedom way either. You're talking about it in a really fundamental, you know, these claims about how it's an infringement of freedom to be told you have to wear a mask. I mean, you're talking about it in a much deeper level of what it means to, you know, take over a culture and have the herd to act in certain ways. But I just don't really see why it's such a big threat. I don't see why the carbon dioxide level in your blood is a really big threat, because
it's a huge threat.
Most of us...
Trish, most people don't understand that in your breath is 5% carbon dioxide exhaled. In the ambient atmosphere, it's 0.05. No, it's 0.05.
I'm not wearing it for 20 hours.
That's fine, but it's 0.05. Carbon dioxide is extremely important physiologically. It's one of the reasons you were an athlete, that if somebody is hyperactive, you can have them breathe into a bag. The effect is the same as wearing a mask. It calms you down. It's physiological.
Sorry, when you're half an hour in a grocery store?
It's not a question of half an hour in a grocery store. This has effects. It has effects on your teeth enamel. It has effects. It's 100% more, 100% more. And the problem is maybe not a problem. People don't mind, and I think the more you wear the mask, the less you will mind by definition. But people learn, they adjust. You can practice yoga. There's a yoga of the mask. There are all kinds of ways to do this properly. You can treat a mask as you treat a scuba mechanism, exhale with a certain amount of force, etc. Because simple pressure, that's Avogadro's law, will change that concentration. But that's not the point. The point isn't really that. Isn't the point really that everyone is now going to be slated to get very interesting vaccines and very interesting PCR tests that for some reason have to be administered deep in the nose and deep in the throat, and sometimes even more unpleasantly in China, right, where they have decided to humiliate people even more. But all those things say one thing to me alone, just one thing, because of the old biologist in me. These are ways of getting to a membrane with this complete and easy access to the bloodstream. That's all. That's all.
Yeah.
You can vaccinate someone in lots of ways. Lots of ways. A little drop. You've been to Africa. It's very simple. A little oral thing. It's not a problem. Sugar cube.
Yeah. I'm just glad I'm not dead and my son's not dead.
We are too.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah,
Me too.
we're all glad about that, but not sure what that comment meant. All glad not to be dead.
Yes, we are. Well, we're being towards death. I wanted to thank Babette and Dan and all the participants for an absolutely fascinating conversation. Babette, I've already had some messages about your talk. We uploaded it here. Will it be uploaded to the Heidegger Circle website so that we can put it there and make it available in the permanent copy of the proceedings?
That's true. You can also get the footnotes.
Yes, and yes, your endnotes, your famous endnotes. But thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to get to hear your performance. And it's leaving me with a lot of questions, which I will send to you. It takes a while for me to digest these things, as I'm sure it is for everyone else. But thank you very much. Róisín, is there anything that you want to say to people in advance of next weekend?
Next weekend.
Thank you all so much for the last 2 days. It has been wonderful. I've enjoyed every single minute of it. I've been here every single minute of it. I've popped out for literally 5 minutes every now and again. But it has just been wonderful. Thank you so much, Babette. I completely almost always agree with absolutely everything you say. So I just loved your talk today. I would have loved if we had more time. It is 5:20 here, and it is, believe it or not, 1:20 where Babette is in the morning. So I am going to let her go, though I would love to have spent more time with you, Babette, and ask more questions. Next Friday, May 14th, we're starting at 9 a.m. PST time. And the panel is Being and Time and Belonging. So back to the book itself. And we will reconvene then. And I give you 2 links. So now your first link is redundant. You can just get rid of that link and follow the second link. And the second link on the last email that I sent you has day 3 and 4. And that link will let you into both days. So if there's nothing else, I see Tyler Tritton is here today with us. I think he might be gone. He's in Gonzaga, and anybody else that is at Gonzaga, if you want to come to the Onion this evening, and if anybody wants to travel from New York or Oregon or Seattle or indeed Canada, or Germany or Italy, you're more than welcome to come to the Onion tonight, and we would love to host you. And we will be having dinner in about 1 hour from now. So you better hurry and get that plane, put on your mask. Yes. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Babette. I
Thanks,
enjoyed
Pat.
that.
Thank you, Babette.
Bye.
Thanks.
Greetings. Greetings. Bye, Sharon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Phyllis.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.